I have often reflected that my friend Hercule Poirot possesses the most remarkably contradictory nature of any man I've ever known. Here is a fellow who can spend 20 minutes arranging 3 chrysanthemums in a vase with mathematical precision, yet who will, without hesitation, plunge head-first into the most perilous and bewildering of criminal investigations. On that grey December afternoon, when the whole extraordinary affair began, he was demonstrating both aspects of his character with typical thoroughness. The little Belgian detective sat in his favorite armchair in our London flat, his egg-shaped head tilted at precisely the angle he found most conducive to thought. Before him lay a perfectly symmetrical tea service, a china pot containing his beloved tisane, 2 slices of toast cut into exact triangles, and a small crystal vase holding those aforementioned chrysanthemums. The fire crackled with mathematical regularity. Poirot had trained our landlady, Mrs. Fowler, to add logs at precisely timed intervals, and the whole scene radiated an almost oppressive sense of order. "The English winter, Hastings," he observed, adjusting one flower by perhaps a millimetre, "is a crime against nature itself. It lacks the honest brutality of a continental winter, with its clean snow and sharp frost. Instead, we have this—" He gestured toward the window, where a dismal rain drummed against the glass. "This grey dampness that seeps into one's very soul. At least it keeps the criminals indoors," I replied, settling into my own chair with the evening paper. "Though I suppose that means fewer cases for you." Poirot's green eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Ah, but you are wrong, mon ami. The winter, it concentrates the criminal mind wonderfully. When people are trapped together, forced into proximity by weather and circumstance, that is when the true nature emerges. The masks, they begin to slip." As if summoned by his words, there came a sharp rap at our door. Mrs. Fowler's voice could be heard in the hallway, and presently she appeared with a visitor whose very presence seemed to bring the chill of the December evening into our warm sitting room. The woman who entered was perhaps 35, tall and elegant, wrapped in a fur coat that sparkled with melting snow. Her face was pale and aristocratic, framed by hair of an unusual platinum shade that caught the lamplight. But it was her eyes that arrested my attention, grey as winter ice, and holding within them a fear so profound it was almost palpable. "Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice carrying the faintest trace of some foreign accent. "I am Lady Millicent Ashworth. I come to you because I believe someone is going to die." Poirot rose with his characteristic punctilious courtesy, bowing over her gloved hand. "Madame, you honor us with your confidence. Pray, be seated near the fire. You are cold, and I perceive that you are also very much afraid." She took the offered chair, but perched on its edge, as though ready for flight. Her hands, I noticed, trembled slightly as she removed her gloves. "You are very perceptive, Monsieur Poirot. Yes, I'm afraid. Terrified, if I am to be entirely honest." "Fear," Poirot observed gently, "is often the most logical of emotions. Tell me, Lady Millicent, what has brought you to my door on such an evening?" She drew a folded paper from her handbag with hands that shook visibly. 3 days ago, I received this. It was slipped under my bedroom door during the night." Poirot took the paper and examined it carefully. His eyebrows rose slightly as he read aloud. "The frosted mask conceals a heart of ice, but ice melts, and when it does, blood will stain the snow. Before the year ends, one among you will wear their last disguise." "Most poetic," he murmured, "and most sinister. You have kept this secret?" "Entirely. I dared not show it to anyone, not even my husband. But then, yesterday, something else occurred." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I found a dead raven on my dressing table. Its throat had been cut, and beneath it was a note that read simply, 'The first mask slips.' When I summoned my maid to remove it, both the bird and the note had vanished. She swears she saw nothing." Poirot leaned back, his fingertips pressed together in his familiar gesture of concentration. "And you believe this threat is connected to Ravenshollow Hall?" she said quickly. "My husband's family estate in Yorkshire. We're hosting our annual Christmas house party there, a tradition spanning 3 generations. The guests arrive tomorrow, and with this weather—" She glanced toward the window where the rain had begun to turn to sleet. "We shall be quite cut off from the world. The house is isolated, Monsieur Poirot. When the snow comes in earnest, the roads become impassable." "And who are these guests who will be trapped with you?" Poirot asked. Lady Millicent's composure cracked slightly. "That is what terrifies me most. Each one of them has reason to hate my husband or to fear him. There is his cousin, Gerald Ashworth, who stands to inherit everything if my husband dies without an heir. Gerald's wife, Vivian, a beautiful woman with expensive tastes and a husband whose finances are strained. My goddaughter, Rosalind Fortescue, a sweet girl but one whom my husband recently disinherited after discovering her secret engagement to a man he disapproves of. Captain Michael Trent, that same young man, a war hero, but one whose pride my husband has systematically destroyed. Sir Edmund Carew, my husband's former business partner, whom my husband ruined in a particularly vicious takeover. And finally, Professor Marcus Whitfield and his sister Agatha, old family friends, but ones who know certain secrets about my husband's past that could destroy his reputation. I found myself leaning forward, fascinated despite myself. "Good Lord, it sounds like a powder keg." "Precisely," Lady Millicent whispered, "and my husband, in his arrogance, seems to relish the situation. He has been dropping hints about revelations and settling old scores. He speaks of this Christmas as though it will be definitive." Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the increasingly heavy precipitation. "The snow, it comes," he observed. "Already the rain turns to ice. Tell me, Lady Millicent, what is it you ask of me?" "Come with us," she said urgently. "I can arrange it. My husband is vain enough to be flattered by the presence of the famous Hercule Poirot. He fancies himself a connoisseur of mysteries, though only the fictional variety. Come to Ravenshollow Hall and watch. Because I know, with absolute certainty, that someone in that house is planning murder." Poirot turned from the window, his expression grave. "You speak of frosted masks, madame. Tell me, what do you believe this phrase signifies?" Lady Millicent's hands twisted in her lap. I think it refers to the way we all pretend, the way we present pleasant faces to the world while hiding our true natures beneath. But frost is fragile, Monsieur Poirot. When it melts, what lies beneath is revealed, and I fear that what lies beneath in one of our guests is the soul of a killer." The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the increasingly insistent drumming of sleet against the windows. Poirot remained motionless for a long moment, his green eyes distant with thought. Finally, he nodded once, decisively. "Very well, Lady Millicent. I will come to your Christmas house party. But I warn you, if there is indeed a murderer among your guests, my presence may not prevent the crime. It may only ensure that justice follows swiftly after." She rose, relief flooding her features. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Thank you." As the door closed behind her and the echo of her hurried footsteps faded on the stairs, I turned to my friend. "You really believe there's danger?" Poirot moved to his chair and sat down carefully, his expression troubled. "My dear Hastings, when a woman of Lady Millicent's intelligence and social position speaks of fear with such conviction, it is not mere feminine hysteria. There is something very wrong brewing in that Yorkshire hall. I can feel it, like the electricity in the air before a thunderstorm." He picked up the threatening note and studied it again. "The psychology, it is most interesting. This person, they do not simply threaten, they create atmosphere, they build dread. The frosted mask, c'est très symbolique, non? We all wear masks, but some are more dangerous than others." "And the dead bird?" a classic intimidation tactic, but one that vanishes when investigated. This suggests someone with access to the house, someone who knows the routine of the servants, someone who can move freely and unobserved. His eyes narrowed. Someone who is already inside the circle of trust. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning, mon ami. The early train to Yorkshire. Poirot's smile was grim. We go to a Christmas party where, I suspect, someone has already written the guest list for their own private funeral. He rose and moved to the window once more, watching the sleet transform into proper snow. You know, Hastings, I spoke earlier of winter concentrating the criminal mind. But there is something else about snow that is most convenient for the detective. What's that? Poirot's reflection smiled back at me from the dark glass. It preserves everything, mon ami. Footprints, evidence, secrets, all frozen in time until the spring thaw. At Raven's Hollow Hall, nothing will remain hidden for long. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing London in white. Somewhere to the north, in a great house surrounded by Yorkshire moors, a gathering was preparing that would test all of Poirot's legendary powers of deduction. For among those guests, behind one of those frosted masks, lurked a mind bent on murder. And time, like the temperature, was rapidly running out. The morning train to Yorkshire departed London punctually despite the deteriorating weather, carrying us through a landscape that grew progressively whiter and more desolate with each passing mile. Poirot sat in our first-class compartment with characteristic stillness, his green eyes fixed on the snow-laden countryside that rushed past our window. You are thinking about the case, I ventured, breaking the silence as we passed through yet another buried village. I am thinking, mon ami, about masks, Poirot replied without turning from the window. Lady Millicent spoke of them with great conviction, yet I find myself wondering what mask she herself wears. Fear can be a disguise as effective as any other, concealing guilt, perhaps, or cunning. I confess I had not considered this angle. You think she might be involved? I think nothing yet, because I know nothing. That is the danger of accepting a case before one has all the facts. He consulted his pocket watch with a small frown. We shall see what truths emerge when we are all trapped together like actors on a stage. The train began to slow as we approached our destination, a small stone station nearly buried in snow. The platform was deserted save for a single figure bundled in a heavy coat, stamping his feet against the bitter cold. As we descended into the frigid air, the figure approached with military precision. He was perhaps 30, weathered and handsome despite a thin scar along his left cheek. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings? I'm Captain Michael Trent. Lady Millicent asked me to collect you. This was the young man whose engagement to Rosalind Fortescue had so enraged Lord Ashworth. He carried himself with quiet dignity, but there was something in his eyes, a banked anger that spoke of deep humiliation, endured. The drive to Raven's Hollow Hall took nearly an hour through lanes where snow had drifted waist-deep. Trent drove with skill and concentration, speaking only to point out landmarks now barely visible through the falling snow. My family's estate once adjoined the Ashworth lands, he said at one point, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Lord Ashworth bought it at auction after my father's death. He's been very generous in allowing me to visit. The irony in his tone was unmistakable. Before Poirot could respond, we crested a hill, and Raven's Hollow Hall emerged from the white obscurity like a fortress. Built of grey Yorkshire stone, it rose from the moors with narrow windows that peered out like suspicious eyes. Lights blazed from within, warm against the gathering dusk, yet I felt an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Inside, aggressive opulence battled the December cold. We were relieved of our coats by an expressionless butler and immediately ushered into the great hall, where a roaring fire failed to warm the psychological temperature of the room. Standing before the hearth was our host, Lord Ashworth himself. He was a man of significant bulk, with a florid complexion and small, hard eyes that gleamed with malicious intelligence. "Monsieur Poirot," he boomed, his voice echoing off stone walls. "My wife said she'd summoned the cavalry. I expected someone taller, but I suppose the best poisons come in small bottles, eh?" He laughed at his own wit, a sound devoid of genuine mirth. "Come, meet the vultures." The drawing room was cavernous, filled with heavy furniture and the low murmur of strained conversation. As we entered, absolute silence fell. The guests were arranged in distinct clusters like opposing armies during a ceasefire. Gerald Ashworth, thin and nervous, stood near the drinks cabinet trying to make himself invisible. Beside him, his wife Vivian held her cigarette holder like a weapon, her sharp cheekbones and crimson mouth giving her a predatory appearance. Her eyes appraised Poirot with calculating amusement. By the window stood the young lovers, though apart. Rosalind Fortescue looked pale and drawn, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. Captain Trent's military bearing couldn't mask the simmering anger in his posture as he glared at Lord Ashworth with raw hatred. Sir Edmund Carew sat in a wing chair, looking shrunken, his hands trembling on the armrests like a man who had already seen a ghost. Near the bookshelves, Professor Marcus Whitfield cleaned his spectacles with methodical precision, while his sister Agatha watched the room with hawk-like intensity. "Everyone," Ashworth announced, clapping his hands violently. "This is the famous Hercule Poirot. Perhaps he's here to arrest one of you. Wouldn't that be festive?" His smile twisted into a grimace. "Look at them, Monsieur Poirot. A room full of masks. Everyone smiling, everyone polite. But can you smell the desperation? It's thicker than cheap perfume." Poirot stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "The mask, Lord Ashworth, is indeed useful. It protects the wearer from the world, but sometimes it also suffocates them." Ashworth's laughter held a flicker of uncertainty. "Brave words, little man. But the snow is setting in. We are all trapped here now. No way out, no way in. Just us and our secrets." As if summoned by his words, wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows. We were sealed in, the stage set, and the air heavy with the promise of violence. Dinner that first evening was a masterpiece of civilized savagery, each course served with a side of psychological warfare. The dining room's candlelight cast restless shadows across faces that smiled with their lips while their eyes calculated and measured. Lord Ashworth presided at the head of the mahogany table like a malevolent monarch, orchestrating discomfort with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of discord. "Tell me, Poirot," Ashworth said, spearing his venison with unnecessary violence. "Do you believe in divine justice? The idea that sinners eventually receive their punishment?" His eyes swept the table with predatory satisfaction, lingering on each guest like a collector appraising his specimens. Poirot dabbed his lips with meticulous care before responding. "I believe, Lord Ashworth, that justice is a human construct. The divine concerns itself with larger matters, perhaps." Spoken like a continental rationalist. Ashworth's laugh held no warmth. "I prefer Old Testament justice myself. An eye for an eye. Debts must be paid." His gaze fixed deliberately on Captain Trent. "Tell me, Captain, how does it feel to live on charity after your father gambled away everything you might have inherited?" The silence that followed was absolute. Trent's jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping beneath his scarred cheek. "My father made mistakes," he said quietly, each word precisely controlled. "But he died with honor. Can every man at this table say the same?" Gerald Ashworth's wine-glass trembled as he raised it to his lips. His wife Vivian placed a steadying hand on his arm, her crimson nails like drops of blood against his sleeve. "Must we discuss such morbid topics?" she asked, her voice honeyed with false sweetness. "Why not?" Ashworth countered. "We're all family here. Well, mostly family. Some are merely hangers-on hoping for crumbs." He turned his attention to Sir Edmund Carew, who sat hunched over his plate like a man already defeated. "Edmund, have your creditors finished picking over the bones yet, or have they left you a decent coat?" Sir Edmund's face had gone the color of old parchment. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It is the festive season." "Festive?" Ashworth barked. "Edmund, you always were sentimental. That's why you failed." "Sentiment is weakness." He gestured toward his cousin. "Gerald here has been supposing all his life. Supposing he'd be rich. Supposing he'd be successful. Instead, he waits for the old man to die." Professor Whitfield cleared his throat nervously, polishing his spectacles with methodical precision. "Perhaps we might discuss more pleasant matters. The snow has made the grounds quite beautiful." But Ashworth would not be diverted. His attention turned to Rosalind Fortescue, who sat pale and drawn, twisting her handkerchief between trembling fingers. "My dear niece, you are unusually quiet. Still dreaming of romance in the snow. Very pretty, very impractical. Gentlemen without fortunes rarely make comfortable husbands." "I am not a child, Uncle Henry," Rosalind said in a strained voice. "Then you will not have missed the reality that love affairs and bank accounts are best kept in separate ledgers. I have merely ensured your future will be secure." Poirot had been observing this psychological torture with those remarkable green eyes, missing nothing. When Ashworth paused to refill his wine glass, the little detective spoke quietly. "You play a dangerous game, my lord." "Games are only dangerous if one doesn't know the rules," Ashworth retorted, "and I always make the rules." "History is filled with tyrants who believe themselves invulnerable," Poirot replied calmly. "They were, without exception, mistaken." The color drained from Ashworth's face, replaced by mottled fury. Before he could respond, the lights flickered ominously. For a moment, the chandelier's bulbs dimmed to mere pinpricks, casting the room into near darkness. In that brief moment of uncertainty, I heard the sharp intake of breath, the scrape of a chair, and something else, a sound like paper rustling. The lights steadied, and normal illumination returned. But something had changed. Lord Ashworth sat frozen, staring down at his plate where a small white card had appeared beside his wineglass. Even from my position, I could see it bore writing in red ink. His face went ashen as he read it. With shaking hands, he crumpled the card and thrust it into his pocket, but not before I glimpsed two words written in what looked disturbingly like blood. "Tonight. Finally." "Henry," Lady Millicent whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Nothing," he snapped, but his earlier bluster had vanished entirely. Merely a jest, someone's idea of dinner entertainment. But Poirot's eyes had narrowed, and I knew he had observed everything. The frosted mask of civility was indeed beginning to crack, and beneath it, something far more dangerous was stirring in the winter darkness of Ravenshollow Hall. The storm had intensified by morning, transforming Ravenshollow Hall into an island of stone and timber surrounded by an ocean of white. From my bedroom window, I could see that the roads had vanished, entirely beneath drifts that reached nearly to the first-floor windows. We were indeed trapped, just as Lord Ashworth had promised with such malicious satisfaction the evening before. Poirot had risen early, as was his custom, and I found him in the breakfast-room meticulously arranging his place setting while studying the other guests with those remarkable green eyes. The atmosphere remained thick with unspoken tensions, each person moving with the careful deliberation of actors who knew they were being watched. "Today, Hastings," he murmured as I joined him, "we begin the real work. Last evening was merely the overture. Now comes the symphony of revelation." Lord Ashworth entered the breakfast-room with aggressive bonhomie, seemingly restored to his previous confidence. "Splendid morning," he declared, though the windows showed nothing but swirling white. "Perfect weather for intimate conversation. I do hope you slept well, Poirot. Today I thought you might enjoy meeting my guests properly." individual consultations, as it were. Poirot dabbed his lips with mathematical precision. But of course, Lord Ashworth, I find that people reveal their true natures most clearly when removed from the herd mentality. The first interview took place in the library, where Professor Whitfield sat hunched over a leather-bound volume like a man seeking refuge in scholarship. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his spectacles, and when Poirot spoke, he started as though awakened from a nightmare. "Professor, you knew Lord Ashworth at university, I understand?" "Yes, at Cambridge. Brilliant fellow even then. Ruthless, but one admired the efficiency of it." Whitfield's voice carried the weight of old regrets. "We were friends once, before the war changed everything." "Changed how, precisely?" Whitfield glanced toward the door, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "Henry was involved in military procurement during the final months. There were irregularities, supplies that never reached the front, money that disappeared into private accounts. Soldiers died because equipment failed, Monsieur Poirot. I knew about it, but I was young and frightened. I should have spoken then. And now he uses your silence as leverage? 3 months ago, he summoned me to London. He had discovered certain personal letters I had written during that period, indiscreet correspondence that would destroy my reputation if made public. He threatened exposure unless I attended this gathering and remained silent about our shared past." Poirot's fingertips pressed together in his familiar gesture of concentration. "Yet someone else knows Lord Ashworth's secrets. That note last evening, you observed his reaction?" Whitfield's face went grey. "If Henry believes I have betrayed him, he will destroy me without hesitation. But I swear to you, Monsieur Poirot, I have told no one about the war. No one." The second interview brought Captain Trent, whose military bearing could not disguise the banked fury in his eyes. He sat with rigid precision, every line of his body speaking of barely controlled emotion. "You love Miss Fortescue?" Poirot observed without preamble. "I do. And she loves me, though her uncle has made that love a weapon against us both." "How so?" Trent's jaw clenched. "He has torn up the trust her father left her. If she marries me, she will have nothing, but more than that. He hints at secrets about my past, things that could destroy my reputation entirely." "What secrets, Captain?" "That is what terrifies me most." Trent's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I cannot imagine what he might know, or think he knows. My military record is exemplary, my conduct beyond reproach. Yet he speaks as though he holds my entire future in his hands." Poirot studied the younger man carefully. "You served with distinction in France?" "I did my duty, nothing more." "And yet Lord Ashworth suggests otherwise." Trent's scar seemed to whiten against his suddenly pale face. "He delights in psychological torture, Monsieur Poirot. He creates fear where none should exist, doubt where there should be certainty. It is his particular genius." The third interview was with Sir Edmund Carew, who entered the library like a man walking to his own execution. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold his teacup, and his voice was barely audible above the wind outside. "Sir Edmund, you were Lord Ashworth's business partner." "Once, before he decided that partnership was less profitable than acquisition." The older man's laugh held no humor. "Henry has a talent for discovering the precise moment when a man is most vulnerable, then striking with surgical precision." "He ruined you?" "Systematically and thoroughly. But that was merely business. What terrifies me now is that he possesses certain documents, papers that would reveal mistakes I made during our partnership. If he produces them, my remaining reputation will be destroyed entirely." Poirot leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Yet you continue to accept his invitations." "Because refusal would trigger immediate exposure. At least this way, I retain some hope that his attention will focus elsewhere." As Sir Edmund departed, Poirot turned to me with a grave expression. 3 interviews, Hastings, and already the pattern emerges. Our host collects secrets like a connoisseur collects rare wines. storing them carefully until the moment comes to uncork them. But someone in this house has decided that Lord Ashworth's cellar of secrets must be destroyed before he can sample its contents. The grandfather clock chimed noon, its notes echoing through the silent house like a countdown to some inevitable catastrophe. The afternoon brought an oppressive stillness to Ravenshollow Hall, as though the very walls were holding their breath. The blizzard had intensified beyond anything I had witnessed, transforming the windows into sheets of white that made the house feel more isolated than ever. Poirot had grown increasingly restless, pacing the library with uncharacteristic agitation while the other guests retreated to their separate corners like animals sensing an approaching storm. "The tension, Hastings," he murmured, pausing beside the frost-covered window. "It builds like steam in a kettle. Someone grows desperate. Someone prepares to act." His words proved prophetic. At precisely 4 o'clock, as the grandfather clock began its solemn chime, a scream shattered the silence, high, terrified, and unmistakably feminine. The sound seemed to echo through every corridor of the great house, freezing my blood in my veins. We raced toward the source, Poirot moving with surprising speed despite his usual measured gait. The scream had come from the conservatory, that glass-walled sanctuary at the rear of the house, where exotic plants struggled against the Yorkshire winter. As we burst through the doors, we encountered a scene that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Lady Millicent stood frozen near the entrance, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror, staring at the floor beside a towering palm. There, sprawled in an unnatural position, lay Gerald Ashworth. His slight frame was twisted grotesquely, one arm outstretched as though he had been reaching for something when death claimed him. Beside his hand lay a heavy bronze statuette of Atlas bearing the world, its base dark with what could only be blood. "Do not touch anything," Poirot commanded sharply, his voice cutting through the shock that held us all motionless. He knelt beside the body with professional efficiency, his fingers searching for a pulse at the neck, though the unnatural angle of the head told its own grim story. "Is he—" Lady Millicent whispered, her face white as the snow beyond the glass walls. "He is dead," Poirot confirmed gravely, rising to his feet. "His neck has been broken. The blow from the statuette was merely the beginning. Someone finished the work with their hands." By now the other guests had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Vivian Ashworth pushed past the others, her sophisticated mask slipping entirely as she saw her husband's body. "Gerald!" she cried, starting forward until Poirot blocked her path with gentle but firm authority. "Madame, please, you must not disturb the scene of the crime." "Crime?" Lord Ashworth appeared last, his usual bluster evaporating as he took in the scene. "But who would want to kill Gerald? He was harmless, ineffectual. What threat could he possibly pose?" "That," Poirot said quietly, beginning his meticulous examination of the conservatory, "is precisely what we must determine." He moved with the precision of a surgeon, noting every detail. The bronze statuette bore clear evidence of impact, but it was the victim's position that seemed to fascinate him most. Near Gerald's outstretched hand, partially hidden beneath a fallen leaf, lay a small piece of paper. Poirot retrieved it with tweezers from his waistcoat pocket, unfolding it carefully. "Another note," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "written in the same red ink, the same precise hand." He read aloud, "The first domino falls. The chain reaction has begun." Captain Trent stepped forward, his military bearing rigid with tension. "Domino? Does that mean there will be others?" "It suggests," Poirot replied grimly, "that this murder was planned as part of a sequence. Gerald Ashworth was not killed for his own sins, but as the opening move in a larger game." "But why Gerald?" Rosalind whispered, her voice breaking. "He never hurt anyone. He was just—" "There. Perhaps that is precisely why he was chosen," Poirot mused, his green eyes distant with thought. To demonstrate that no one is safe, or perhaps, he paused, studying the scene once more. Perhaps he knew something that made him dangerous to our killer. Lord Ashworth rallied with desperate authority. This is impossible. Some intruder must have broken in during the storm. A burglar, a madman. Observe the snow beyond these glass doors, Poirot interrupted, gesturing toward the pristine white expanse visible through the conservatory walls. Not a single footprint approaches the house. The doors are locked from within. No, Lord Ashworth. The killer did not come from outside. The killer stands among us in this very room. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Each guest looked at the others with new eyes, suspicion replacing shock, fear replacing grief. The frosted masks were beginning to crack under the weight of murder. "We must secure this room," Poirot announced with quiet authority. "Then we shall gather in the library, all of us, without exception. The police cannot reach us through this storm, so I shall conduct the investigation myself. And I warn you all, if we do not unmask this killer quickly, Gerald Ashworth will not be the last to die before the snow melts." As we prepared to leave the cold conservatory, I caught Poirot's troubled expression. "What disturbs you?" I whispered. "Everything, mon ami," he replied softly. "The victim, the method, the theatrical note. It is all too neat, too obvious. In my experience, murder is rarely so conveniently packaged unless someone wishes to deceive us about their true intentions." The game, it seemed, had only just begun. The library had transformed into an impromptu courtroom, its heavy crimson curtains and towering shelves of leather-bound volumes creating an atmosphere of judgment and reckoning. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, the wind howling like some frustrated beast denied entrance, while, inside, the assembled guests arranged themselves with the careful deliberation of actors who knew they were performing for their lives. Poirot positioned himself before the great fireplace, the flames casting restless shadows across his egg-shaped head as he surveyed each face with those remarkable green eyes. He did not pace, nor did he raise his voice. Instead, he radiated a calm, terrifying certainty that commanded absolute attention from every person in the room. "We are gathered here," he began softly, his accented voice carrying to every corner, "because one among you has crossed the line from resentment to murder. Gerald Ashworth lies dead in the conservatory, his neck broken by hands that were strong, decisive, and utterly ruthless. But murder, mes amis, is rarely a solitary act. It is the climax of a long drama. And so, we must examine not merely the final scene, but the entire performance." Lord Ashworth sat heavily in his wing chair, his earlier bluster entirely extinguished by the reality of death in his own house. Lady Millicent stood slightly behind him, one hand resting on the chair's back as though requiring support, her face pale as the snow beyond the frost-laced windows. Vivienne Ashworth had collapsed into an armchair, her sophisticated mask cracked, revealing something raw and desperate beneath. "We shall begin," Poirot continued, "by establishing the movements of each person during the critical period between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, when Gerald met his end. Lady Millicent, you discovered the body. Where were you immediately prior to this discovery?" She twisted her handkerchief between trembling fingers, her voice barely above a whisper. "In my sitting room, writing correspondence. I came to the conservatory because I needed to collect orchids for tonight's dinner arrangement. It's something I do every afternoon when we have guests. When I entered, I saw—" Her voice broke entirely. "I saw Gerald lying there beside the palm tree, so still, so broken." "You observed no one else? Heard no retreating footsteps, no closing doors?" "Nothing. The conservatory was utterly silent except for the sound of sleet against the glass." Poirot nodded gravely and turned his attention to Vivienne Ashworth, whose carefully applied cosmetics could not disguise the genuine shock in her eyes. "Madame, you have lost your husband. My deepest condolences. But I must ask, where were you at the time of his death?" "In my bedroom," she replied, her voice flat and emotionless. I had developed a severe headache from the altitude in this dreadful weather. My lady's maid brought me tea and headache powders at 3:30. She can confirm this. I remained there, resting until Lady Millicent's scream brought me running. "And your relationship with your husband? It was harmonious?" Vivienne's laugh held no warmth. "Gerald was weak, Monsieur Poirot, always living in his cousin's shadow, always hoping for approval that never came. We had our difficulties, certainly, but I did not kill him. What would be the point? His death leaves me with nothing." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Nothing? But surely as his widow—" "Gerald had no independent fortune," Lord Ashworth interrupted harshly. "Everything he possessed came from the estate, and the estate is entailed. With Gerald dead." He paused, seeming to struggle with the implications. "With Gerald dead, the primary inheritance passes to my wife, Lady Millicent." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. All eyes turned to Lady Millicent, who stood frozen, her face white as marble. "Henry," she whispered, "surely you cannot think—" "I think nothing yet," Poirot interjected firmly, "but I observe everything. Captain Trent, your whereabouts during the critical period?" The young officer straightened in his chair, his scarred face impassive. "I was walking in the grounds, despite the storm. I needed air, needed to clear my head after this morning's tensions. I returned through the east entrance at approximately 10 minutes past 4. The butler can confirm the time. I asked him to prepare hot water for washing." "A convenient absence," Lord Ashworth sneered, "walking in a blizzard when no one could verify your movements." Trent's jaw clenched dangerously. "If I had wanted to kill someone in this house, Lord Ashworth, I would not have hidden behind anonymous notes and theatrical gestures. I'm a soldier, not a coward. Yet you possess the physical strength and training necessary to break a man's neck," Poirot observed quietly. "It is a technique taught in military combat, is it not?" "It is. But my quarrel was never with Gerald. He was merely another victim of this house's poison." Poirot turned to Sir Edmund Carew, who sat hunched in his corner like a man already condemned. "Sir Edmund, I'm told you spoke with Gerald earlier today. What was the nature of your conversation?" The older man's hands trembled violently as he set down his untouched brandy. He asked me for money. Again. Despite knowing my financial ruin was imminent, he threatened to reveal certain past indiscretions to Lord Ashworth if I did not pay him immediately." "Blackmail," Poirot murmured. "A dangerous game for a desperate man. So Gerald had become predatory in his final days." "More desperate than any of us realized," Sir Edmund whispered. "He spoke of debts, of threats from creditors. He was terrified, Monsieur Poirot, but that terror had made him reckless." Professor Whitfield cleared his throat nervously from his position near the bookshelves. "I was in the morning room, working on some notes. My sister Agatha joined me shortly after 3 and remained until we heard the commotion." Agatha Whitfield nodded curtly, her hawk-like features sharp with intelligence. "That is correct. Neither of us left the morning room during the relevant period." "How fortunate," Poirot observed, "to have each other as witnesses." "And Miss Fortescue?" Rosalind looked up with red-rimmed eyes, her voice barely audible. "I was in the music room, practicing piano. I play when I'm anxious, and this house makes me terribly so. The room is quite isolated. No one would have heard me." Poirot began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression grave. "So we have Lady Millicent alone in her sitting room, Madame Vivienne alone in her bedroom with a servant's partial alibi, Captain Trent alone in the storm, Miss Fortescue alone at the piano, the professor and his sister together, providing mutual verification, Sir Edmund alone with his desperation and his brandy." He paused before Lord Ashworth, who had grown increasingly pale during the questioning. "And you, my lord? You have been remarkably quiet about your own movements." Ashworth's face flushed crimson. "I was in my private study, attending to confidential business correspondence." I'm not accustomed to accounting for every moment of my day to anyone. Yet accounting you must, Poirot replied gently. For you see, the psychology of this crime is most revealing. Gerald Ashworth was killed not for who he was, but for what his death represents. The note made this clear. The first domino falls. This suggests a sequence, a carefully planned campaign rather than a crime of passion. He moved to the frost-covered window, gazing out at the impenetrable white curtain that sealed them off from the world. We are dealing with a mind that thinks in patterns, in psychological warfare. Someone who enjoys the game of fear as much as the act of murder itself. Turning back to face the assembled suspects, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And that someone sits among us now, wearing a mask of innocence so perfect that even as we speak of murder, they maintain their performance. But masks are fragile things, especially under pressure. Before this storm ends, the truth will emerge. And if it doesn't? Lady Millicent asked, her voice trembling. Poirot's expression was grim as granite. Then I fear Gerald Ashworth will not be the last to die in this house. For whoever killed him has tasted blood, and such appetites, once awakened, are rarely satisfied with a single victim. The wind howled against the windows with renewed fury, and somewhere in the depths of the great house, a clock chimed the half-hour, marking time toward whatever revelation or tragedy awaited them in the hours ahead. The hours following Gerald Ashworth's death settled over Ravenshollow Hall like a shroud, transforming the grand estate into a prison of suspicion and fear. Dinner was served with funeral precision, the empty chair at the mahogany table serving as an accusation that no amount of civilized conversation could dispel. Lord Ashworth had insisted on maintaining normal routines, but his forced bonhomie rang hollow against the reality of murder stalking his halls. Poirot ate sparingly, his attention focused not on the excellent roast, but on the subtle interplay of emotions around the table. I noticed his green eyes narrow as he observed Vivian Ashworth's surprisingly steady hands, the trembling that had marked her earlier grief now conspicuously absent. Captain Trent sat with military rigidity, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the candlelit silver, while Sir Edmund Carew consumed wine with the desperation of a man seeking liquid courage. The weight of secrets. The oppressive silence was finally broken by Professor Whitfield, who set down his fork with deliberate precision. We cannot simply pretend nothing has happened. A man has been murdered under this roof. We should be searching for evidence, questioning suspects, not maintaining this charade of normalcy. What would you have us do? Lord Ashworth demanded, his voice harsh with strain. The telephone lines are severed, the roads impassable. We are trapped here with a killer, yes, but we are also trapped with each other. Panic serves no purpose. Sir Edmund's bitter laugh cut through the tension like a blade. Panic. You speak of panic, Henry, when this entire house is built on secrets that would destroy us all. The wine had loosened his tongue, and his words carried the weight of decades of suppressed truth. Every person at this table has something to hide, something they would kill to protect. Gerald was simply the first to pay the price for knowing too much. Lord Ashworth's face flushed dangerously. You're drunk, Edmund. Perhaps you should retire before you say something you'll regret. Regret? Sir Edmund rose unsteadily, gripping the table for support. I regret everything, Henry. Every deal we made, every corner we cut during the war. The military procurement contracts, the diverted supplies, the soldiers who died because equipment never reached the front lines while we lined our pockets with blood money. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. Professor Whitfield had gone white as chalk, his hands trembling as the implications struck home. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his expression grave with new understanding. You speak of war profiteering? The little detective said quietly. This is a most serious allegation. It's the truth, Sir Edmund whispered, all bravado draining away. During the final months of the war, Henry controlled military supply contracts. Equipment was diverted, sold on the black market. Faulty gear reached the trenches, while the good material disappeared into private hands. Men died, Monsieur Poirot, because Henry Ashworth valued profit over honor. The midnight investigation. After the explosive dinner, the guests retreated to their rooms like animals seeking shelter. Poirot, however, signaled for me to follow him not toward our chambers, but back to the conservatory. The scene of the crime held secrets that daylight had failed to reveal. The glass-walled sanctuary was eerily beautiful in the moonlight, frost patterns creating intricate lacework on the windows, while exotic plants cast strange shadows across the tiled floor. Poirot moved with purposeful precision, his small flashlight cutting through the gloom as he examined the area around the palm where Gerald had died. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, kneeling beside the large plant. "The soil here has been disturbed, but not by the struggle. Someone buried something, then retrieved it hastily." He parted the earth with his silver paper knife, revealing fragments of torn paper. "Aha, as I suspected." With infinite care, he extracted the pieces and arranged them on his handkerchief. The fragments bore Gerald's distinctive handwriting. "Meet me at 4 by the palms. Must talk. Alone. Urgent matter concerning H's wartime activities. Cannot wait longer." "Gerald called someone here," I breathed. "He knew about the war profiteering." "Precisement, but see how he tore up the note, buried it in his nervousness. Gerald feared leaving written evidence, yet he was desperate enough to arrange this meeting. Someone came, Hastings, and that someone silenced him permanently." Poirot's examination revealed more secrets. On the underside of a broad leaf, he discovered a small smudge. Not dirt, but mechanical grease. From a weapon, perhaps, or machinery that required maintenance. Our killer is methodical, but even the most careful planner cannot control every variable. The second strike. Our investigation was interrupted by the sound of shattering glass from the upper floors. We raced up the grand staircase to find Sir Edmund's bedroom door standing open, chaos within. The window had been smashed, letting in a blast of freezing air and snow. Sir Edmund lay groaning near the fireplace, clutching his shoulder where blood seeped through his fingers. "A shadow," he gasped as Poirot knelt beside him. By the window, I saw the reflection in the mirror, turned just in time. But Poirot's examination of the scene revealed a different truth. While the window appeared to have been broken from outside, suggesting an external intruder, the little detective's trained eye caught crucial inconsistencies. A fragment of glass lay near the door, far from the window's trajectory. The snow that had blown in formed a pristine drift, unmarked by footprints or disturbance. "The window was broken from inside," Poirot announced grimly. "Staged to suggest an external threat, but the staging was flawed. The physics do not align with the evidence." The pattern emerges. As the other guests gathered in the corridor, drawn by the commotion, Poirot's expression grew increasingly grave. Lord Ashworth appeared in his dressing gown, more annoyed than concerned, while Captain Trent arrived fully dressed despite the late hour, a detail that did not escape the detective's notice. "Sir Edmund," Poirot said gently, "before the attack, what were you seeking in your room?" "A letter," Sir Edmund admitted weakly. "Something Gerald mentioned about proof of Henry's wartime dealings. He said it was hidden in the heart of the house. Those were his exact words." The phrase sent a visible tremor through several guests. Professor Whitfield adjusted his spectacles nervously, while Lady Millicent's face went ashen. Even Lord Ashworth's bluster faltered momentarily. "The heart of the house," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Not merely a metaphor, I think, but a specific location known to those familiar with Ravenshollow Hall's secrets." As the group dispersed, each person retreating behind locked doors and mounting suspicion, Poirot drew me aside. His expression combined satisfaction with deep concern. "The pattern becomes clearer, mon ami. Gerald discovered something about the war, profiteering, evidence that could destroy Lord Ashworth. He arranged a secret meeting, but his killer struck first. Now Sir Edmund, who knew the same secrets, has been attacked but not killed. Why? Because the killer needs him alive for some purpose, or because the real target has not yet been reached. He paused at the head of the staircase, his green eyes reflecting the flickering gaslight. We are dealing with a mind that thinks in layers, Hastings. The frosted masks are indeed slipping, but what we see beneath may not be what we expect. Tomorrow, we must find this heart of the house, before our killer strikes again. For I fear the deadliest revelation is yet to come. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, sealing us in with secrets, lies, and a murderer who had tasted blood and found it to their liking. The night was far from over, and dawn seemed an eternity away. Sleep had been a stranger to most inhabitants of Ravenshollow Hall that night. The wind had finally exhausted its fury by dawn, leaving behind an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the frost-covered windows like a held breath. The house itself appeared to sag under the weight of accumulated snow and accumulated secrets, its ancient stones bearing witness to yet another night of fear and suspicion. Poirot emerged from his room with characteristic precision, his appearance immaculate despite the circumstances. I found him in the breakfast room, methodically arranging his place-setting while observing the other guests with those remarkable green eyes. The atmosphere remained thick with unspoken tensions, each person moving with the careful deliberation of actors who knew they were performing for their lives. The morning revelation. "Today, Hastings," he murmured as I joined him, "we must solve the riddle of the heart." Gerald Ashworth spoke these words to Sir Edmund, and they nearly cost the old man his life. But what did he mean? Every great house has its secrets, hidden passages, priest holes, concealed safes. Ravenshollow Hall is 3 centuries old. What secrets might it harbor? The other guests drifted in gradually, their faces drawn with exhaustion and weariness. Sir Edmund appeared with his arm in a sling, the makeshift bandage lending him the air of a wounded animal. Lord Ashworth attempted something resembling his usual swagger, though the effect was greatly diminished by the events of the previous evening. After breakfast, Poirot requested an audience with the family housekeeper, Mrs. Dalrymple, a formidable woman with iron-grey hair and an expression that spoke of 42 years of faithful service to the Ashworth family. She arrived in the library with the rigid posture of someone deeply disapproving of all that had transpired. "Mrs. Dalrymple," Poirot began courteously, "you have served this family many years. There is no one who knows this house as you do. I am particularly interested in one phrase, the heart of the house. Does this suggest anything to you?" Her stern features flickered with something like alarm. "Who told you that, sir?" "Sir Edmund mentioned it. He said Mr. Gerald spoke of proof hidden in the heart of the house." Mrs. Dalrymple hesitated, her hands tightening on her apron. "It is an old name, sir. The late lord used to call the family vault that, a sort of inner sanctum where the most precious things were kept. But it's not what you might think, sir. It's not a room at all." The heart revealed. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "Then what is it, madame?" "Follow me, sir, if you please." She led us to the great hall, where portraits of Ashworth ancestors gazed down from gilt frames with the stern disapproval of generations past. Mrs. Dalrymple stopped before the largest painting, a magnificent oil portrait of the first Lord Ashworth, painted in the 17th century. The frame was massive, ornately carved with the family crest, an ancient oak tree with the motto, "Strength from Roots," inscribed beneath. "The heart of the house," she said quietly. "The First Lord called it that because he said the family's strength came from remembering their origins. Behind this portrait is a cavity built into the wall itself. Only the head of the family knows how to open it." Poirot studied the elaborate frame with intense concentration, his fingers tracing the carved oak leaves and acorns. "And Lord Ashworth, he uses this hiding place?" "I wouldn't know, sir. I've never been shown the mechanism. But She hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. "I have noticed him standing here at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, always alone." After dismissing the housekeeper, Poirot continued his examination of the portrait frame. His methodical fingers explored every carved detail until suddenly there was a soft click. A section of the gilded molding swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow cavity behind the canvas. The discovery. From this ancient hiding place, Poirot withdrew several items: a leather-bound ledger, yellowed with age, a collection of photographs, and a bundle of correspondence tied with ribbon. As he opened the ledger, his expression grew increasingly grave. War correspondence, financial records, photographs of meetings that should never have occurred, he catalogued softly. Here are the dates, the amounts, the diverted shipments that Sir Edmund spoke of last evening. The evidence of Lord Ashworth's war profiteering, preserved for nearly 3 decades. But as he continued examining the contents, his frown deepened. "Yet observe, Hastings, these documents have been disturbed recently. Some pages bear fresh fingerprints, and here," he held up a photograph. "This has been copied. The original shows signs of having been photographed with modern equipment." "Gerald found this hiding place?" "Gerald, yes, but not only Gerald. Someone else knew of its existence, someone who made copies of the most damaging evidence before replacing the originals. This suggests a mind that thinks in layers, not merely seeking immediate blackmail, but planning for a longer game." The confrontation, our investigation, was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Ashworth himself, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and desperation. "What are you doing with my private papers?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "I am examining evidence of treason and murder," Poirot replied calmly. "This ledger details how you profited from the deaths of soldiers during the final months of the war, how you built your fortune on diverted supplies and faulty equipment that cost lives in the trenches." Ashworth's composure cracked entirely. They were going to die anyway. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Why let good equipment rot in warehouses when it could secure the future? I did what was necessary for survival. And Gerald, was his death also necessary for survival? For a moment, Ashworth's face went white, then flushed crimson. "Gerald was a fool who didn't understand the complexities of business, but I didn't kill him. Yes, I paid him to keep quiet about the ledger, but murder? Never." Poirot studied the older man carefully. "Yet someone did kill him, Lord Ashworth. Someone who knew about this hiding place, who understood the significance of what it contained. Someone who feared exposure not merely of war crimes, but of something far more personal. The psychological game." The little detective began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "You see, the psychology of this crime is most revealing. Gerald was killed not because he was a threat to you, Lord Ashworth, but because he was a threat to someone else. Someone who had been using your secrets for their own purposes, who had built their own plans around your guilt." He turned to face the assembled group, for by now the other guests had gathered, drawn by the commotion. "The murderer of Gerald Ashworth stands in this room. They wear a mask so perfect that even now, as we speak of their crime, they maintain their performance. But masks are fragile things, especially under pressure." Captain Trent stepped forward, his scarred face grave. "Monsieur Poirot, if you know who the killer is, surely you should reveal them now. We've all suffered enough." "Patience, Captain. The revelation must come at the proper moment, when all the pieces are in place. But I will say this, before the day ends, the frosted mask will finally slip, and we shall see the true face of murder." The final setup. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows through the frost-covered windows, Poirot made his announcement. "This evening, after dinner, I shall gather you all in the conservatory, where this tragedy began. There, with all the evidence before us, I will reveal not only the identity of Gerald Ashworth's killer, but the complex web of secrets and lies that made murder seem the only solution. The guests dispersed with visible reluctance, each retreating to their rooms like actors preparing for a final performance. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when all masks would fall and the truth would finally emerge from the shadows that had haunted Raven's Hollow Hall. As Poirot carefully returned the evidence to its hiding place, he turned to me with an expression of profound sadness. "The heart of the house, Hastings. We have found it at last. Not merely a hiding place for documents, but the rotten core that has poisoned this family for decades. Tonight, we shall see what grows from such corrupted roots." The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its notes echoing through the silent corridors like a countdown to judgment. Somewhere in the depths of the great house, a killer waited, their carefully constructed plans beginning to unravel under the relentless pressure of truth. The endgame was approaching, and with it would come revelations that would shake the very foundations of Raven's Hollow Hall. The conservatory had been transformed into a theater of judgment, its glass walls reflecting the candlelight in countless frost-etched fragments, while exotic plants cast writhing shadows across the assembled company. Each guest sat precisely where Poirot had positioned them, their faces illuminated by flickering flames that seemed to strip away the last vestiges of civilized pretense. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that amplified every breath, every nervous rustle of fabric. Poirot stood before them with his back to the exact spot where Gerald Ashworth had died, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly as though listening to voices only he could hear. When he finally spoke, his accented voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "The unraveling begins. We are gathered here because a man was murdered in this very room," he began quietly. "Gerald Ashworth died not because of what he had done, but because of what he knew and what he threatened to reveal. His death was theatrical, calculated to inspire fear and misdirection. But murder, mes amis, is never as complicated as the murderer wishes us to believe." He began his methodical elimination, his green eyes moving from face to face like a surgeon's scalpel. "Professor Whitfield, you knew of the war profiteering because you facilitated it, providing false documentation for equipment that never reached the front lines. Gerald threatened to expose this, giving you powerful motive. Yet you lack the physical strength to break a man's neck, and your alibi with your sister holds firm." The professor sagged with relief and shame in equal measure. Poirot continued his systematic dissection. "Captain Trent, you possess both the military training to kill efficiently and profound motive. Your father's regiment suffered because of the conspiracy we have uncovered. Yet you are a soldier, trained to kill cleanly and directly. This murder was theatrical, psychological, not your method. Sir Edmund, you staged your own attack to appear as a victim rather than a suspect. Clever, but unnecessary. Your financial desperation made you a victim of blackmail, not a perpetrator of murder." The heart of deception. Lord Ashworth shifted uncomfortably as Poirot's attention turned to the remaining suspects. "Lady Millicent, you came to me in London with tales of threats and dead ravens. You created the narrative of external danger before any murder occurred. Why? To ensure that when death came, it would appear to be the work of a madman rather than someone within the family circle." Lady Millicent's hands trembled, but Poirot's gaze had already moved on to the figure who had remained remarkably composed throughout the proceedings. "But it was not Lady Millicent who killed Gerald Ashworth," he announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "It was someone whose mask was so perfect, so carefully constructed, that even now she maintains her performance." All eyes turned to Vivian Ashworth, who sat smoking with studied nonchalance, her crimson lips curved in what might have been amusement. The revelation. "Madame Vivienne," Poirot continued, "you have played your role magnificently. The sophisticated wife, bored and cynical, trapped in a loveless marriage to a weak man. But that mask conceals a far more complex truth. You did not marry Gerald Ashworth for love or even for money. You married him for access. Access to this house, to its secrets, to the evidence that could destroy Lord Ashworth. Vivian's cigarette paused halfway to her lips, the first crack in her perfect composure. You see, I found something most interesting in the heart of the house. A photograph from 1918 showing a meeting between the conspirators. In the background, partially hidden by a doorway, stands a young woman, a clerk, perhaps, or a secretary. Someone who witnessed everything but was considered too insignificant to matter. He produced the photograph, holding it so all could see. That woman, 25 years younger but unmistakable in her features, was you. You were there when the conspiracy began. You saw soldiers condemned to death for profit, and you waited patiently for your opportunity to exact justice. The confession. Vivian slowly extinguished her cigarette, her mask finally beginning to slip. Very clever, Monsieur Poirot. Yes, I was there. I was a typist in the procurement office, invisible to men who saw only their own ambitions. I watched them condemn better men to death for money, and I swore that one day they would pay. So you cultivated Gerald, married him, gained access to this house and its secrets. But Gerald discovered your true purpose. He found evidence that you had been systematically copying documents, building your case. And Gerald, weak as he was, could not allow his wife to destroy the family that defined his existence. He threatened to expose me, Vivian admitted, her voice now devoid of emotion. After years of patience, of playing the devoted wife, he was going to ruin everything, so I asked him to meet me here. I told him we could discuss a compromise. But when he arrived, still babbling about family loyalty, I realized there could be no compromise. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Captain Trent stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled fury. You killed an unarmed man. I killed a coward who valued reputation over justice, Vivian corrected coldly. Gerald knew what his cousin had done, knew that soldiers died because of Henry Ashworth's greed, and he chose to protect the family name instead of honoring the dead. The final truth. Poirot's expression remained grave. Justice and vengeance are not the same thing, madame. You speak of honoring the dead, yet you have become a murderer yourself. The frosted mask has indeed slipped, revealing not the monster we expected, but something far more tragic. A woman who allowed her pursuit of justice to transform her into the very thing she claimed to despise. As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of engines could be heard approaching through the cleared roads. The authorities were finally arriving to restore order to the chaos that had consumed Ravenshollow Hall. Vivian Ashworth stood motionless as Captain Trent moved to restrain her, her carefully constructed facade shattered beyond repair. The mask had finally melted away, revealing the terrible human cost of secrets buried too long in the frozen heart of a great house. The arrival of Chief Inspector Japp brought with it the machinery of official justice, his familiar figure a welcome sight after the claustrophobic tension of recent days. The veteran inspector listened to Poirot's account with the patience of long experience, occasionally interjecting sharp questions but never disputing the Belgian's methodical reasoning. Behind him, constables moved through Ravenshollow Hall with professional efficiency, securing evidence and restoring the authority of law to a house that had been ruled by fear and secrets. The Reckoning. Vivian Ashworth maintained her composure even as the handcuffs were applied, her elegant bearing unbroken by the reality of her situation. She had removed her mask so completely that there seemed nothing left to hide, no pretense worth maintaining. As she was led past Lord Ashworth, she neither looked at him nor spoke, her disdain more eloquent than any final accusation could have been. "Mrs. Ashworth," Japp said quietly, "you understand the charges against you." "I understand everything, Inspector," she replied, her voice steady as Winterstone. "I've understood for 25 years. The only thing I failed to understand was that in becoming their judge and executioner, I had become no better than they were. Lord Ashworth's arrest followed swiftly. The evidence Poirot had uncovered, the ledger, the photographs, the damning correspondence, painted an irrefutable picture of wartime profiteering that could no longer be buried beneath layers of respectability and time. As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, the man who had ruled Ravenshollow Hall with such tyrannical authority seemed to shrink before our eyes, his bluster permanently extinguished. The Crown has been waiting for an opportunity to act on certain wartime irregularities, Japp explained to the assembled household. These documents and the copies Mrs. Ashworth had already forwarded to the appropriate authorities provide more than sufficient evidence to proceed. The farewells. The remaining guests departed like actors after a final, devastating performance. Captain Trent and Rosalind Fortescue left together, their future finally freed from the shadow of Ashworth's threats. The young couple's relief was tempered by sorrow for the lives lost and the family destroyed, but there was also hope in their faces, the first genuine emotion I had seen in that house since our arrival. "Monsieur Poirot," Captain Trent said, extending his hand with military precision, "you have given us back our future, but at such a cost." "The cost was paid long before we arrived," Poirot replied gently. "We merely witnessed the final accounting." Sir Edmund Carew, his arm still bandaged from his staged attack, approached with hesitant steps. The revelation of the war crimes had lifted a burden from his shoulders, even as it promised new troubles ahead. "And what of those of us who knew but said nothing?" he asked quietly. "Are we not also guilty?" Poirot's green eyes held infinite compassion. "Guilt and complicity take many forms, Sir Edmund. The courts will determine legal responsibility, but perhaps the greater judgment lies in what each person does with the truth now that it can no longer be hidden." Professor Whitfield and his sister departed with quiet dignity, their long-held secrets finally released into the light. The academic's hands no longer trembled as he shook Poirot's hand. The weight of 30 years of silence had been lifted, replaced by the cleaner burden of facing consequences. The heart of truth, Lady Millicent remained until the end, overseeing the closing of a house that would never again be home. Her composure was different now, not the brittle control of a woman hiding terrible secrets, but the steady strength of someone who had finally stopped pretending. "You spoke of frosted masks, Monsieur Poirot," she said as we prepared to leave. "I wore one too, the mask of the dutiful wife, loyal despite everything. But loyalty without conscience is merely cowardice dressed in prettier clothes. And now, madame, what will you do?" Her smile was sad but genuine. "I will testify truthfully at both trials. I will sell this house and use whatever remains to establish a fund for veterans' families, those who suffered while men like my husband profited. It will not restore the dead, but perhaps it will honor them." The journey home. The train back to London carried us through a landscape transformed by fresh snow, the harsh realities of recent days softened beneath a blanket of pristine white. Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his methodical mind processing not just the facts of the case, but its deeper implications. "You are troubled," I observed, as the Yorkshire moors gave way to more civilized countryside. "I am thinking about masks, Hastings," he replied softly. "We began this case with Lady Millicent speaking of frosted masks that conceal hearts of ice. But we discovered something more complex, that sometimes the mask becomes the face, and the wearer forgets who they truly were beneath." He turned to gaze out at the passing landscape, where evening shadows stretched long across the snow. Vivian Ashworth was not born a killer. She was created by the injustice she witnessed, shaped by years of nursing grievances until vengeance became indistinguishable from justice in her mind. She wore the mask of the sophisticated wife so perfectly that she lost herself within it. But surely justice has been served. Both she and Lord Ashworth will face trial. "Justice?" Poirot's expression grew grave. The law will do what it can, yes, but consider, soldiers died 30 years ago because of Ashworth's greed, and he will finally face consequences. Gerald Ashworth died 3 days ago because his wife sought to punish crimes the legal system had ignored. Where is the justice in such a sequence? It is more like a Greek tragedy where the sins of one generation poison the next. The return to order. Our flat in London welcomed us with its familiar comforts, the fire crackling with mathematical regularity, the tea service arranged with geometric precision, the chrysanthemums positioned exactly as Poirot preferred. After the chaos and violence of Ravenshollow Hall, such domestic order felt like a benediction. "The case is closed," Poirot announced, settling into his chair with visible relief. "The frosted masks have melted, the truth stands revealed, and justice, imperfect though it may be, will take its course." He reached for his tisane, then paused, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Hastings, I've solved many cases in my career. I've exposed murderers and brought them to justice, but this case troubles me because there are no true victors, no satisfying resolution. Gerald Ashworth was weak, but not evil. Vivian was driven by genuine grievance, transformed into murderous obsession. Lord Ashworth will face punishment, but decades too late for those who suffered from his crimes." "Perhaps," I suggested carefully, "justice is not always about satisfying outcomes. Perhaps it is simply about revealing truth, however uncomfortable that truth may be." Poirot nodded slowly, his green eyes distant with thought. "Perhaps you are right, mon ami. The masks have been removed, the secrets exposed to light. Now we must all live with the uncomfortable reality that evil is rarely simple, and justice is never clean." He adjusted his perfectly arranged place setting with characteristic precision. "But at least order has been restored to this small corner of the world, and sometimes, Hastings, that is enough." Outside our window, London continued its eternal dance of light and shadow, a city full of secrets and masks, of hidden truths waiting to be discovered. But for now, in this moment of hard-won peace, Hercule Poirot was content to contemplate the perfect symmetry of his chrysanthemums and the reassuring certainty that truth, however painful, would always triumph over deception in the end. The frosted mask affair was closed, but its lessons would linger, a reminder that beneath every civilized facade lies the capacity for both nobility and corruption, and that the line between justice and vengeance is often far thinner than we dare to admit.